Very pleasant good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you're located and whatever your time zone is, welcome to the Chronicles, and this is Rita Gadi. In a few days, Imelda Marcos, our former First Lady, would be celebrating her 95th birthday. So we felt it, just correct and proper that of the many things that I have talked about as far as her life, her achievements, and many of the things that she has done for her country over the past, since 2006 or thereabouts, that we have been the Rita Gadi Hour, and then we had now the Chronicles. And just about every aspect of her life we have talked about. And I think we have covered just about the background of many of the programs and projects that she established and she has achieved. As a matter of fact, you could compile them as it has been compiled in a book called A Biography of Deeds. And that's exactly the span of her activities as she was First Lady. Prior to that, I also talked a little about her family, her relatives, her parents and grandparents, and the heritage that she has actually. But today, I think we have to talk about her historic travels because it affects the method and the manner by which we have conducted our foreign policy in a very impacting way. I should say that because of her travels, her historic travels, and I'll mention three of them, many of the things that we are discussing now with all of these people talking about the South China Sea, talking about relationships with other countries, etc., can be traced back to the origin of how we had diplomatic relations or relationship, diplomatic and otherwise, with the big countries, small countries, and the important countries that now is in the landscape of our foreign policy. It has been said that if you want to know what is happening in a nation, find out what is happening to the writers. But since this generation, or at least contemporary people who would want to know what is happening in the world, hardly ever read, or there are hardly any writers anymore about what's happening in our country and in other countries for that matter. I really cannot say that much about them. But as far as we are concerned, do we have enough writers that are really writing about what is happening in our country other than politics, senatorial and congressional investigations, what we read in the newspapers? Because even if you glance at the newspaper, not glance, if you open your newspapers, what do you see on the front pages? Mostly, activities in sports, an actress divorcing or separating from her husband, a couple that will be getting married. Most of these are celebrities. And then somewhere in the front page, you will find some pronouncement made by our president or our cabinet members, if they do make certain announcements, which is rather rare. But then again, I'm trying to come out with that particular state that we're in, that we do not have enough writers that will be writing about many things happening in our country other than what is sensational or what is scandalous. So, what is happening to our writers? Parang wala na. what is happening is we have a lot of social networking, and this you hear the voices of bloggers, of TikTokers, of those in social media. And I don't know if you could call them the town criers, but I think that's what I am. That is what the Chronicle is all about. That is somebody who stands in the middle of the square and then starts announcing, oh, this is the edict now from the Lord and Master, from the king, or these are the pronouncements from the leader of the town, and you cry it out. That's why you call them the town criers. Because we are, in a way, not just the bloggers or those in social networking or those putting on their um, activities by all the different applications of social networking. They're actually what we can call the seismographs of our age, and they calibrate what's happening to our country. But that's not what I want to do. What I'm going to do now in this full hour is to talk about Imelda's historic travels as a chronicle that I'm actually completing and hopefully will be publishing as the historic travels of Imelda Romualdez Marcos. So these are the writers, that should actually be talking about many of what has happened in the past, because that is where we trace the fundamentals and the origins of what happened with our relationship with countries, especially countries that are now evolving as hegemons. Of course, we've known the United States of America as the most powerful country in the world for quite a while and fighting to hold on to its hegemon. And then now you have the People's Republic of China, or China for short. And of course, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which has which has released about 13 or 14 of its republics and is now known simply as the Russian Federation, no longer like the United States of America, no longer as the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, because the socialist republics have already been given their own freedom and their independence. So we'll talk about this because our writers are strangely silent. And so, is our era brooding, asleep, or do we have some undeciphered disturbances that people are not talking about or have rather chosen to remain quiet? But that is not what I am. As a chronicle, I have to talk. And for the past so many years, that's exactly what I've been doing. So let's get to this travels that Imelda Romualdez Marcos has undertaken. Let me just run through several of the countries that she has actually visited as she was First Lady: Canada, Egypt, Britain, Spain, Italy, Germany, Belgium, France, Austria, Japan, Korea, this is South Korea, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, of course, the ASEAN countries, India, Kenya, Mexico, Japan, Saudi Arabia, the other Saudi Arabian neighbors, which have also developed now as other countries, Morocco, at the time of King Hassan II, also in, what is this, Denmark, in Belarus, and then in, well, of course, in Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was still the president of Iraq, and then, of course, in Iran, during the anniversary celebration when the Shah of Iran was still the Shah of Iran. And they had this massive parade of their history, from which Imelda patterned her Kasaysayan ng Lahi, which we had here also for the, remember, the Miss Universe contest, we had that big parade of our evolution as a people, from the cavemen, the Neanderthals, and all the way to the different tribes that have existed to this day. And then, of course, all the different foreign invasions that we had, 300 years of Spain, and then a little of Britain and Portugal, and then, of course, the United States of America, and then the last World War until we came to the granting of Philippine independence. That was the Kasaysayan ng Lahi. I mention it in passing because what actually inspired Imelda to do this at the time, since the Miss Universe contest is going to be held for the first time here in our country, she wanted to show the world what our country is, where it's located, and our history, our roots, the fundamentals of what our origin actually is until the present day. So that was the kasaysayan ng lahi. You could still Google this and perhaps watch how it was. Really a massive, thousands of participants in that parade. But nevertheless, this is just in tangent that I'm talking about it because this is part of the several countries that Mrs. Marcos has visited. Australia, for instance, with the inauguration of what we see in as a landmark of Canada, of Australia, and then of course Libya, which is also quite critical at that particular time and to this day. But there are three countries that I will actually zero in as far as Imelda Romualdez Marcos travels are concerned, historic, as I say, and these are the People's Republic of China, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and now called the Russian Federation, and of course the Jamahiriya of Libya, with the capital in Tripoli, when Muammar Gaddafi, colonel, was still the president of that country. So before we go into those historic places that Mrs. Marcos visited, how is it that I can talk about this in a manner firsthand? Well, of course, because my assignment then in the office of the president for the Channel 4 television network was firstly to cover the office of the president, and then secondly, when Mrs. Marcos would be traveling abroad, also to join her in her travels and to do either mini documentaries on this or short reports regarding those travels. And of course, the importance of this meetings that she has had with the leaders and the countries that she has visited and of what relevance it has to our country then at that particular time. So you could see that it is important that I record this. In fact, I have several boxes of my diaries regarding this. I don't have it in front of me. So this is all by memory, actually, that I mentioned the countries that she has visited. Many of this actually have already, at that time, even established diplomatic relations with our country. And that is why you will recall that every once in a while, there are anniversaries being celebrated and commemorated, either in the country of where it is established, and of course here in our own country from these countries. And recently, we've also had new countries being acknowledged as part of our diplomatic relationships. But be that as it may, you will see all of this in a manner of speaking. Just recently, when we had the Van d'Honneur, which is usually after the Independence Day celebration, that is the toast of wine, acknowledging all the different ambassadors of the countries with whom we have diplomatic relations. The Van d'Honneur, we had this now recently, June 12 in the evening, with President Ferdinand Romualdez Marcos Jr. and the First Lady Liza Araneta Marcos also there giving their toast to all the ambassadors. So the countries that I have mentioned, there are even more. I think there are now 100 or so with whom we have diplomatic relations, but not all of them have been visited by Mrs. Marcos. So I just mentioned some of those that I can remember where she has gone to. Of course, the ASEAN is very important. At the time, when she was First Lady, it was still beginning as the SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and then eventually it became the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations of 5 member countries. And so it was part of the diplomatic ritual that the President Marcos, would visit in the first year. As a matter of fact, in the first months of his inaugural as President of the Republic, the 5 member countries of the ASEAN. Now the ASEAN has expanded to 10 member countries. And so it will be expanding further if other countries would also be joining in. But be that as it may, at the time of the first ladyship, if I could use that word, which I'm coining now, of Imelda Romualdez Marcos, she has visited all of these ASEAN countries, our neighbors, so to speak. And there has been the continuous strengthening of not just trade and economic relations, but also cultural relations with these countries. And in like manner, too, with the other countries that she has visited, which I have mentioned in random as far as my memory goes. So it is that, well, being assigned to the office of the president was already something which was an honor, as far as I'm concerned. And then when Mrs. Marcos was invited as First Lady to address the United Nations General Assembly, I think this was the first time at that time, and I don't know if it has been replicated to this day, that the First Lady of a country would be invited to address the General Assembly of the United Nations. And so she was invited to do this, and that was a most historic address that she delivered, because normally you have either heads of state or the ambassadors, the representatives to the United Nations that would be addressing the General Assembly. This was usually occurring by September, and that would last till about 2 weeks or so, unless there were an extension of meetings that are going to be held. But so you can imagine that of 150 countries or more that are part of the General Assembly, they are all there gathered to listen to what Mrs. Marcos at the time, as First Lady of the Republic of the Philippines, would be addressing. And her message was entitled, "The New Human Order." Prior to that, as I've said, most of the speeches were all about, well, they talk about their country and how great they are, or how difficult it is when you come out from a developing country and then you're addressing other big countries. And so it is actually some kind of a platform for which many of these representatives are able to express what exactly is needed, what is demanded, what should be done. Of course, it is always a call to the United Nations General Assembly to listen and to find out how countries can actually help each other. But that is not exactly what has been happening. Of the 75 years or so that the United Nations has been in existence, it has been, well, lackluster, so to speak. Every time there is a difficulty in a country, how many countries will come to the succor and the support? And usually it is the big countries that come to help, but then of course there are strings attached, so that you have all of the politicking and the maneuvering and the manipulation that occurs. And this has been going on for quite a while. We have the Security Council also in the General Assembly and in the entire United Nations, representing several countries that have the veto power, as a matter of fact. But how effective has it been when a country wishes to invade another country? Are the other countries coming in to object to this? Well, if they do, their objection is usually it's vetoed down. So again, that is a call of the other nations, members of the United Nations, to the General Assembly itself. So when Mrs. Marcos addressed them for the first time as First Lady, and perhaps I don't know if it was repeated by other First Ladies, it was the new human order that she talked about. And you can find her speech in our archives and our history. And that was really quite historic. So after that, I think she has also been requested to address other United Nations assemblies that were held in other countries. The role of the Filipino woman, the role of women in general, where she expressed also the role of the Filipino woman as an example and as a model for this. And also several other international conference, like the conference in Nairobi in Kenya for the non-conventional sources of energy, because it was Mrs. Marcos who organized here when she was governor of Metro Manila, the idea of having 1 million trees surrounding the metropolis, so that we have enough oxygen for the uh, urban climate that is actually being polluted by all the exhaust coming from the vehicles. And of course, there's also the intent to have this greening revolution that she initiated, so that we could use all of these trees that could be grown as trees in 5 years' time, that could be undertaken also in the rural areas. So she was invited for several of the projects that she has done and executed and achieved here in our country during that international convention on international conference on non-conventional sources of energy. And we were privileged also to have covered that conference, and the opportunity to have been able to interview the other heads of state. Indira Gandhi, for instance, was one of those that we were able to interview at that international conference. So be that as it may, she was also invited for the first habitat organization of the United Nations in Canada because of what she has done when she was Minister of Human Settlements. And that was really something which was also historic for our country, where you had one department that undertook the different activities and the different services that are needed by a community to be able to survive and to sustain its survival. That was the human settlements, actually. And there she lined up 11 basic services, which are actually 11 basic needs of a human community: water, power, food, clothing, shelter, justice, education, recreation, sports and activities, ecological balance, and so forth. So 11 basic needs and 11 basic services, mobility and transport also included. And that became the model of the human settlement that she has organized when she was Minister of Human Settlements here in our country. And because of that, she was an honorary guest when Habitat, which was in a way parallel to the human settlements that she had here in our country, if not actually patterned after the human settlements what we have here. So you had the UN Habitat, which was launched in Canada, and she was the honored guest for this. Again, her speech revolved around what the successes were and the difficulties and the problems encountered when human settlements were being organized and attended to here in our country. This is also where you had low-cost housing condominiums, 5 floors only, so that you need not have elevators for this, but you had what they called the bliss housing, which actually was the acronym for Bagong Lipunan Sites and Services, becoming part of the human settlements. And that was also part of the habitat, which was patterned after many of the human settlements that Mrs. Marcos established here in our country. So that's how it goes. And you can imagine how significant her speeches were in this different international conferences. And those were also important travels that she has undertaken when she was First Lady. Now let's get to the 3 countries that are very critical at that particular time and even today, and their contemporary history and the different concerns that the world has and the countries surrounding these areas have, as far as the People's Republic of China, the Russian Federation, and the Jamahiriya Libya. This was in September 1974 in China. But before that, it was in Moscow when an invitation was extended for Mrs. Marcos to visit the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic and to land in Moscow. You must understand how the world at the time was diametrically, ideologically, politically divided between communism and democracy. So you had the allies of those who were pro-communist, and then you had the allies of the democratic way of life with the United States of America. So there was this division of the world, so to speak, between the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. Wow, what a division it was. If you are still viewing some of the old films of Ian Fleming, James Bond films, that was exactly what the situation and the geopolitical atmosphere was at the time, when you had all of this high level and sophisticated espionage being undertaken between agents and collaborators and diplomatic and undiplomatic relationship between countries that were pro-democracy and countries that were pro-communist. So that was the situation when, as we said, there was a severe division, ideological, politically, and oh my goodness, really quite stark and quite strict as far as the world was concerned when Mrs. Marcos landed in Moscow. What a welcome she was given then. And at the time, the invitation was extended to her delegation so that that actually began the first steps towards the opening of our diplomatic relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the state visit of our president at the time, Ferdinand Edralin Marcos. And because of that, our country and our delegation of Mrs. Marcos must have visited the USSR almost what, 3, 4 times a year since the establishment of diplomatic relations. So you can imagine, not only was she so welcome in Moscow and in Russia, but she has been requested to visit in several diplomatic missions and several affairs that will have to be undertaken by her on that particular level when there were some difficulties on the diplomatic level. And one of this, for instance, I must mention this. She has also been made an honorary guest in the Tchaikovsky piano competitions because one of her scholars, a young girl at 18 years old, Rowena Arrieta, competed in that international Tchaikovsky piano competition in Moscow. And she won second place at a very young age. My goodness, she was Mrs. Marcos Scholar in the Conservatory of Music in Moscow. She was also a scholar of Mrs. Marcos at Mount Makiling, where you had all of these young, gifted artists studying there, actually living there to perfect the genius of their art. And Rowena Arrieta was one of those who was her scholar at the Mount Makiling School for the Arts. And Mrs. Marcos listened to her there and noticed how outstanding her performance was. And because of that, decided to enroll her at the Moscow Conservatory of Music. At the time, we also had Cecilica, another international piano artist, who was already Mrs. Marcos Scholar at the Juilliard School of Music in New York. So Mrs. Marcos thought of having the other side of the world, having a Filipino scholar, and that was Rowena Arrieta. And she was indeed an outstanding pianist. As a matter of fact, when she would walk the streets, you know how culturally inclined the Russian people are. They knew her exactly, para siyang Nora Honor. They would call her name, Rowena, Rowena, you know, and they would listen to her rehearsals from the street corners or the sidewalks when the windows were opened and she was rehearsing her piano pieces. And of course, there was the competition, which is internationally broadcast, and that was where Rowena Arrieta won second place at a very young age. So again, as we've said, the entrance of the Philippines into the severest winters in Russia, also the severest division of the world, which is divided between communism and democracy, actually began with Mrs. Marcos opening the Iron Curtain and entering the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic in Moscow. And after several visits, not only by invitation but by necessity, she was awarded the highest award that the communist country of Russia could give a foreigner, and that was an award for a comrade. And so we take pride in that because as a lady, as our first lady, she was given the highest award to a non-Russian, which is the Comrade Award for Mrs. Marcos. Well, as I've said, she's also been invited every year for that international competition as a guest of the International Tchaikovsky Piano Competition. But be that as it may, she has also attended several high-level meetings with Russian officials, one of which, for instance, I must mention this because this is important for us to realize how important and significant her presence is and how she handles these diplomatic missions, especially coming from, well, as we've said, with no background on foreign relations academically, but she is a major of geography and history. And that, I think, um, entitled her to be truly capable of dealing with different countries of the world. She knew exactly where they're located. She knew the neighbors of these countries. She knew also the rivers, the main rivers, and of course, the historical places which she visited when she went to these places likewise. So there was one occasion when, as we have already established diplomatic relations with the people's, with, I'm sorry, with the USSR, the Soviet republics, they wanted to have the same treatment in accordance with other countries that have already established diplomatic relations with us, and that is to have their airline uh, be part of the commercial flights that would be coming to the Philippines. Aeroflot was their commercial airline, and that was what they wanted to establish because even though they had a completely different ideology and political affiliation and were really anti-American in every sense of the word at that time, they still would hold on to the fact that since we have diplomatic relations with them, why can they not have their commercial airlines also be part of the other whatever privileges are being given to other countries with whom we have established such a relationship. So that was the high level meeting that was going on in Moscow. And Mrs. Marcos was part of the delegation, although she was not really in the official meetings as yet, because there were other meetings that she had with the cultural attaché and the cultural minister of the Soviet Union and several others in culture and in education and so forth. But since the discussions were not getting headway because the instructions of President Marcos was that we could not at that particular time in history allow the Russian planes to land in the Philippines precisely because we were still under the banner of the two biggest bases of America here. And that was the Clark Air Base and then, of course, the Subic Naval Base. And so when the discussions were not really getting any headway in favor of what President Marcos wanted achieved, then Mrs. Marcos is invited to join. And here, as I've said, this is one of those perhaps not talked about in detail, but this is how it went. When she was there in front of the foreign minister, Andrei Gromyko, and they were discussing why, as diplomatically as possible that we cannot as yet allow Aeroflot to land in the Philippines and have this exchange of flights from Manila to Moscow. So Mrs. Marcos opened by saying that she comes from a city or a place which faces the Pacific Ocean, where typhoons actually ravage her her eastern seaboard, and the eastern seaboard of our country for that matter, something like 24 times or more a year. And these are violent storms that actually hit our eastern seaboard. And so because of that, the airplanes of other countries that may be coming in or leaving will have to park at the Clark Air Base because that air base is the biggest hangar in order to protect these airlines. And so Mrs. Marcos said that that is the situation as far as the weather in our country is concerned. And if Aeroflot will be allowed to land in our country, and since we are visited by just one typhoon a month, are they willing to land there or to park their airplanes in the American hangar in Clark Air Base. Well, there was, of course, a moment, not a moment, but half a day recess, and they talked about the weather and, of course, double checked how it is. And when they came back, that was it. No, we are not willing to do that. So, what President Marcos instructed his entire delegation to achieve, Mrs. Marcos was able to achieve in just one conversation. So common sense, so like her, coming from Tacloban, coming from Ulot, coming from the eastern seaboard of our country, where really, under common sense, we are visited by the strong typhoons 24 times a year. And so that was it. I have to mention that because that actually is crucial at that particular time. Nowadays, of course, it's a different matter altogether, but you must consider the geopolitical arena that we were working in at that particular time. So that was the opening of our diplomatic relations with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic by the first steps taken by Imelda Romualdez Marcos. Now let's get to China. That was September 20, 1974. China was also communist right after, shortly after the Long March and the Cultural Revolution completion of Chairman Mao Zedong, who was now in retirement in Yan'an, in the province of Yan'an. And a severely divided world, so too it was with China, although at the time, China was just beginning its progress and its development, but nonetheless, it was still very critical as far as the world was concerned, because if you have the hegemon United States of America, which is democratic, and then you had the war in Vietnam, which has just been concluded with the Americans evacuating of, I'm sorry, with the Americans moving out of Vietnam. And then you had, of course, the unification of North and South Vietnam. And Mrs. Marcos coming in to Beijing at the height of this Cold War, so to speak. Well, she came with a full delegation, led by, of course, several of our cabinet members at the time. If I can recall, as I said, my diary is in my garage, but if my memory is right, we had Vicente Paterno, who was the Minister of the Department of Trade and Industry, and also the Chairman of the Board of Investments. Then we had the Chief, the Commanding General, I understand, of the Philippine Air Force, General Jose Rancudo, and then, of course, Governor Benjamin Romualdez, who eventually became the ambassador also to China after the diplomatic relations were established. Benjamin Kokoy Romualdez is known. Dato Puti was his nickname to many in the diplomatic corps. With Ambassador Rafael Gonzalez, protocol officer that we had in Malacanang for many years. Of course, Director Gregorio Sandana, our director in the National Media Production Center, and of course, Channel 4. We had Ambassador J.V. Cruz, who eventually became ambassador to London, and then ambassador to Algeria, and eventually also ambassador to several other countries, to London, as a matter of fact. And then we had a great number of journalists. I think there are close to 20 of us who joined that delegation of Mrs. Marcos. The first opening of a Filipino diplomat, if you would call her that, entering Beijing, September 20, 1974, 10 days of September. And a book was written by Larry Cruz, who was Secretary of Information, a beautifully written book with all the full-page photographs of what Mrs. Marcos did during those 10 days. Oh my goodness. Flying 4 hours directly from Manila to Beijing. So we had a chartered flight together with all that delegation. I think, if I remember right, she was met by the Deputy Minister of the Foreign Affairs of China, and of course, the wife of the, yeah, I think the wife even of Mao Zedong. I don't have the names exactly here, but there you had a big delegation at the airport receiving Mrs. Marcos, and she was billeted on in Villa number 18. I remember that villa because it's a little palace, if you would call it that, a little castle, so to speak, and it is a guest house for visiting heads of state, and that was where she was the first visitor or the first occupant of Villa number 18 in Beijing. And she visited several other places also. I wrote down some that I could remember. Of course, there was a dinner at the State Hall of the People's at the Tiananmen Square, and then she was also entertained. And part of her guide, not part, but I think the main guide she had was the wife of Chairman Mao, Chiang Ching. If you remember, she's a stage actress herself. And then you had, she visited Tianjin, um, Mangzhou, and then, of course, the Great Wall of China, and even had mass. She heard mass at the Catholic Church in Beijing, a mass at the, well, I forgot the name of that church, but sometime back, maybe I could remember this if I look at my notes. And then, of course, she met. Well, there was a delegation that flew to Yan'an. We rode an 80-seater Trident plane to get to Yan'an, where Mao Zedong was already in retirement. And there, several of the other journalists also joined her, and that was the time when our president now, a young man, was with his mother when they met Chairman Mao Zedong, and then you have the photograph of the chairman kissing the back of Imelda's palm, and that was what was shown throughout the world. You know, actually, it was Mrs. Marcos who made mano po to chairman, and then the chairman acknowledged with the same gesture. But what was photographed and what now remains as the remembrance of that meeting that Imelda Romualdez Marcos had with Chairman Mao Zedong was the kissing of the back of the palm of Imelda Marcos there in Yan'an. I think they had over an hour. There was, of course, a translator. Many things that they talked about. We were not privy to this, only a few members of her delegation. And then, of course, we were able to throw a question when they were coming out to Chairman Mao, asking him what is his vision for China. And that's exactly when he answered, beating his chest with the Chinese name Zhang Wu. And that exactly is the translation of the people of the center kingdom of the world, which China has now become in many ways. So there you have it. And that was the 10 days of September. And Imelda Romualdez Marcos opened the bamboo curtain, not only for the country, but for the rest of the world. Richard Nixon acknowledged this and also was acknowledged by China as one of the first American presidents that's also acknowledged the People's Republic of China. And there was a letter, as a matter of fact, from the officialdom. I think it was Premier Chou En-lai, who gave a letter to Mrs. Marcos to be given to President Richard Nixon, who already resigned from the presidency and was actually in a hospital when we visited him to deliver that letter. So you could see how the world revolved around that historic travel of Imelda Romualdez Marcos with the opening of the bamboo curtain, which eventually opened the diplomatic relations between our two countries, and President Marcos making the historic state visit to the People's Republic of China in Beijing. And that is where he said, once upon a time, in the early days of civilization, we were connected by land bridges. So you could see that that actually was the beginning and the fundamentals of our relationship with this nation now fighting to be on equal standing with the hegemon United States of America. 10 days of September in 1974, with Imelda Romualdez Marcos opening the bamboo curtain for us and in many ways for the rest of the world. I should mention that I forgot to mention this, that in Russia, for instance, she has been able to meet several of the Russian presidents in the many years that she's been going there, and attended also several funerals of this of these Russian premiers and presidents. Um, if I can recall this, I'm sure that she was there, because if I can recall, then you had Brezhnev, you have Andropov, and then you had, uh, um, of course, Chernenko. You can still Google this. I think I made a mini coverage on the burial of Chernenko, and you could still Google this in YouTube. But anyway, that's how important Mrs. Marcos was for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which we now know as the Russian Federation. And then we come to the Jamahariya Libya, with Colonel Muammar Gaddafi as its head of government and head of state. And oh my goodness, that was a very difficult, very critical, and yet a very historical mission. Mrs. Marcos was tasked by President Marcos to go to Libya on the invitation also by the foreign minister of Libya, as they met in, uh, in the General Assembly of the United Nations. The same manner by which we were all, Mrs. Marcos is also invited to Russia and to China by the foreign ministers who were there in attendance um, at the General Assembly. So because of this, President Marcos decided, yes, let us accept the invitation, and you, Imelda, will go to Libya, because right now we are having this difficulty in southern Philippines, where you have Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan actually in that on the table at the Islamic conference, where you had some representatives of the Moro National Liberation Front, Nur Miswari, and the Muslim Islamic Front under under Hashim Salamat, both of them urging the other Arab countries, the other Muslim countries, to help the secessionist movement secede from the rest of our republic. Can you imagine that? Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan to secede from our country. And that was the time when clandestinely the People's Jamahariya of Libya was supporting, not just historically, not just religiously, but materially, logistically, arms and support for the secessionist movement, and that was Gaddafi. And so Mrs. Marcos is sent there to express to President Gaddafi that we are not actually on a genocide, because that was what the Islamic Conference members thought. That was what Miswari was telling them, that we are killing Muslims in Mindanao, and that is why they wanted to secede. So that was the mission of Mrs. Marcos, to come to go to Libya and talk to Muammar Gaddafi and to stop the support that this being given for the secessionists, and to come to some kind of an agreement, or whatever it is that could be formulated, so that they could be given what they would want, maybe autonomy, short of independence. So for 3 days, that Mrs. Marcos delegation, I don't have the names, but it is, as it was in the past, a full level delegation that she had with her, together with generals of the armed forces, members of the cabinet. I remember Jose Aspiras was there, and several others, and several ambassadors likewise. 3 days that she was there in Tripoli. She was met at the airport by Mrs. Gaddafi, no less. And then she was escorted also by Mrs. Gaddafi to several of the places that Mrs. Marcos visited in the 3 days that she was there. But she would still have to meet with Colonel Gaddafi, and that was not at all in her agenda or in her schedule, and that was really quite worrisome. You must remember also that the Minister of Defense, Juan Ponce really was there. Also, General Fidel Ramos also was there, and it was they who said after the third day that Gaddafi was not meeting with the delegation, that they decided to leave. They had long distance calls with President Marcos, and they told President Marcos that, I think we are already on a diametrically opposed stand with Gaddafi and Libya, and nothing is going to happen here, so we might as well go home. and do what we can do to save Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan. So President Marcos talked to Mrs. Marcos and said, Meldy, baka kailangan umuwi na rin kayo. But she said, not yet. My mission here is to talk to Gaddafi and to ask that we should have peace in Mindanao. And so she said, I am staying. So for 3 days, we visited museums, we visited a hospital, we visited another hospital for children, we visited the ruins of the Roman uh, conquest of Libya. We had the ruins of the French that also conquered Libya. So we saw all of this recuerdos of the colonizers, which is also similar to what Spain had done to us here for 300 years. So that was it. That's why you had Muammar Gaddafi shouting out, saying, "Where is Libya? You have here the Roman Empire, you have here the French Empire, but where is Libya?" And that was where he was just beginning to develop Libya on its own and independent of these colonizers. But for 3 days, he still has not met with Mrs. Marcos. So there are details here which perhaps were not written about or not much is known. But since we were also present, as I said, I can speak of this firsthand. And then, of course, Mrs. Marcos hoping how and working her mind out how she could be able to meet with President Gaddafi or Colonel Gaddafi. So she thought of going to the mother and perhaps talk to the mother of Gaddafi to tell him that, okay, as a mother to mother, can you tell your son that we have been here for 3 days and we want to talk peace and can we meet with him? But then it was also discussed that what if we are not sure if that is the mother that we're going to, because under the Muslim Quran, you could, a man could have 3 or 4 wives. So who is the mother, the real mother of Gaddafi? And so finally, Mrs. Marcos decided, let's go to the father, for that is for sure. But the father was out there in the desert. Oh my goodness. So we had to go to the desert. We had to fly to the desert. But in the desert, he had this huge tent. And there we had, the tent was fit for the president of the leader of Libya. And there was a banquet already prepared for her, but the tent was really huge. It had chandeliers, it was air conditioned, you had carpets and all of this, and it was all the best food that the Libya could offer was there. It was laid out, and then so she was able to tell the old man that she would want to meet with the son, and so soon enough, we were not even through with our meal. We were already told that we could now go back to Tripoli because Gaddafi was now ready to meet with Mrs. Marcos. So after 3 days, finally, when you had Enrile and Ramos already on the way back to the Philippines, I don't know whether they were in Malta or they were already in Rome, but they were out of Tripoli already. And so it was just Mrs. Marcos and the rest of her delegation who was received by Colonel Gaddafi and together with his Minister of State, Al-Treki, Dr. Al-Treki. And of course, that was the beginning of their conversation, a dialogue which lasted a day. And then Gaddafi asked for another day and another day until they came to that particular point when President Marcos and Colonel Gaddafi were already on long distance conversation, looking for the possibility of granting whatever could be granted in lieu of independence. So that was the autonomous regions that would include just the 10 provinces which are connected to each other, the 10 provinces of and 5 cities. So that was exactly how it was, and the conversations that they had with each other, and that was where you had the formation of what is known now, then and now, as the Tripoli Agreement. It took several back and forth talks and several negotiations in this. In fact, it was Undersecretary Carmelo Barbero, together with Colonel Ermita, who was his aide and right-hand man. Colonel Ermita is still around. You could interview him regarding this, and he's one of those living testimony together with myself regarding the Tripoli Agreement of 10 provinces and 5 cities, which also underwent, accepted by Gaddafi himself, into a referendum where the people of this islands of Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan would be able to vote whether they wanted to be part of that autonomous region, because they were the ones actually on the table for secession. And so I was there for the coverage of that plebiscite, or that referendum, as you would call it, and only these 10 provinces of regions 9 and 12, and the 5 cities contained in these 2 regions that decided to be the regional autonomous government of Southern Philippines, established by the Tripoli Agreement. So unlike what we have the BARM today, where you have the one province here, some barangays in my province in North Cotabato, then you had Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi, and then you have the government center in Cotabato City, which is not part of the organic BARM, but since the government center was there, which we established at the time, so that was it. Sad that they did not push through with the Tripoli Agreement, but there was peace indeed from 1977, when the Tripoli Agreement was being formalized and the referendum already by the people approved of this autonomous region, all the way until 1986. There was peace established. And we have to give credit where credit is due, because if you read the statement made by then Minister of Foreign Affairs, Carlos P. Romulo, he wrote an essay and a testimony to this, that it was Imelda Romualdez Marcos who prevented the secession of Mindanao, Sulu, and Palawan, and actually began the establishment of peace in Southern Philippines, written by Minister Carlos P. Romulo. That acknowledges the role of Imelda Romualdez Marcos that she played in that particular era of our history. The critical travel that she had to Libya, and the critical meeting that she had with Muammar Gaddafi. But what happened was, when the administration of Mrs. Aquino came, they fetched Marawi from somewhere. They fetched Miswari from somewhere, and then the rest is history. The war began, conflict again, one after the other. First, it was one autonomous region here. First, it was another autonomous region there, until they finally came up with what they now call the BARM, which is which are which are territories not contiguous, which is really very sad. And then, of course, well, several other matters will have to be taken care of. But now they're crying for a federal form of government, which would be actually going back to the contiguous formation of the provinces in Southern Philippines. So that is where we see how the critical role that Mrs. Marcos had in the critical travels that she had. First, of course, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, which is now the Russian Federation, with whom to this day we have very strong diplomatic relations. And then the People's Republic of China, or China, in 1974. And then, of course, what happened in Libya, which you still have diplomatic relations with, but sadly is now in a very sad deteriorating stage after they removed Muammar Gaddafi, at the time when Gaddafi instituted free education, free housing, free hospitalization, a share in all the sale that they made as far as oil was concerned, and several other benefits given to the people of Libya, which is no longer there. So, and then you had the destruction of Tripoli and several other cities itself. Sad that this is what happened to the country that was once one of the most critical countries in the world, for that matter, and critical as far as our peace is in Southern Philippines, with the establishment of the Tripoli Agreement, which could have been the autonomous regions of 9 and 12, and of course, the 5 major cities. So that is how It goes. We are the stories that our people should look into, because nations and peoples are largely the stories that we write and the stories that we tell. Since not many people are writing now about many things that has happened in our contemporary history, recent as we may call it, other than just what we celebrated 149 years ago with the Philippine Revolution, but here we had about 40 years ago with establishing diplomatic relations with the hegemons of today, so to speak, threatening the hegemon of the United States of America. This is critical. And I can only be a town crier in many ways, talking about it in our program, but we have to write about this, as I am actually writing about it, completing the travels and this historic travels of Imelda Romualdez Marcos, to whom we give credit at this particular stage of our history, when we are now confronted with the crisis with China, and also whether or not we are still in good relationship with Russia, and the problems that Russia is having with Ukraine, so similar to what is happening here in our country, with the pushing of Ukraine by the NATO and the pushing of our country by the United States of America to have some kind of a conflict with another huge country, which is actually a neighbor and a trading partner, and now on an economic upsurge, the People's Republic of China. All of this actually zeroes in on one woman who will be 95 years old on July 2 this year, a couple of days from now. To her we give credit, to her we give the acknowledgement, to her we give the salute. And we thank her for what she has done during her time as First Lady of our Philippine Republic. Thank you for having joined me. This is Rita Gadi for your Chronicles.